Great. So, hi everyone. Welcome. We are all, of course, so pleased to see you here to join us for our discussion of the role of non-state actors in implementing the Paris Agreement. For those of you who I haven't yet had the chance to meet, I'm our moderator today, and I'm Cinnamon Carlarn. I'm a professor at the Moritz College of Law at Ohio State University, and also a proud co-chair of the International Environmental Law Interest Group for ASIL. Before I frame our panel and really our roundtable discussion today and introduce our terrific group of panelists, I wanted to just take a moment to express my thanks, really our thanks, everybody's thanks, to the annual meeting committee, but in particular to Dan Ferger and Peter Sang, who contributed to molding this particular panel, kind of got it on the agenda and helped think through some of the background to it. I also want to thank all of the really terrific ASIL staff and volunteers who are everywhere. They've been really wonderful, done such a diligent job in organizing this kind of massive event, so just a thank you to them. So now, turning to the topic of the day, the role of non-state actors in implementing the Paris Agreement. This is a topic that, of course, occupies increasingly important space in the evolving conversation, and more importantly, in our efforts to conceptualize how we as a domestic community, and more critically, how we as an international community can go about developing more comprehensive and more effective pathways towards limiting emissions and towards limiting the negative effects of climate change on both human and non-human systems. So 30 years ago, really only a handful of scientists or environmentalists might have seen the need for a collective conversation like this one about climate change. And even 20 years ago, there would have seemed very little need to talk about law and climate change. Apart from a couple of international agreements, there just wasn't that much law to talk about. And of course, for our purposes here today, even 5 to 10 years ago, there would have been much less fodder for conversation and many fewer actors in the room to have a sustained and sophisticated conversation about the role of non-state actors in implementing what is increasingly envisioned as a more bottom-up, a more diverse, and intricately woven approach to combating climate change. But today, as we all know, especially those of us in the room, the situation is quite different and, of course, is constantly evolving as we see daily in the news. I teach a climate change law class and an international environmental law class, and I make it a point in that class to every day bring in 2 or 3 stories from the news just that day about climate change to show students how quickly it's changing, both in terms of what we know about the science, but also the policies worldwide. So, it's a very different situation. So at all levels, from cities through the international sphere, laws, regulations, court decisions, and public and private efforts relating to climate change have proliferated. The range of laws and policies in place cover topics ranging from international finance mechanisms to regulation of the electricity grid, to carbon trading, aviation emissions, geoengineering, climate adaptation, resiliency, and everything in between. And more non-state actors are the ones not only influencing or even promulgating many of these laws and policies, but also contributing to their implementation and influencing their effectiveness for better and for worse. So beginning in 2015 with the adoption of the Paris Agreement, we of course have a new, more flexible, kind of bottom-up model as our core international instrument for addressing climate change. And I promised him I was going to call him out. So as our colleague Dan Badansky describes it, and I love this quote, the end result with Paris is a bit of a Goldilocks solution that's neither too strong nor too weak. But for our purposes here today, what the Paris Agreement is, or really what the Paris Agreement does, is it creates, in a different way than before, it creates space for states to look inwards and see what's possible in terms of domestic efforts to limit climate change. And of course, inevitably, looking inward means looking to non-state actors. And of course, we can't ignore the United States, so the increasingly essential role of non-state actors has been dramatically highlighted by President Trump's announcement almost a year ago today in June 2017, which really frames the conversation we're going to have today. And if you remember at that time, President Trump suggested that the United States would, in the administration's words, cease all implementation of the non-binding Paris Accord and the draconian financial and economic burdens the agreement imposes on our country. This includes ending the implementation of the nationally determined contribution, and very importantly, the Green Climate Fund, which is costing the United States a vast fortune. So the United States' de facto withdrawal from the Paris Agreement represented an important inflection point for conceptualizing the role of non-state actors in addressing climate change, because, of course, what we've seen here in the US and what we're going to talk about today is a widespread and concerted effort to mobilize sub-federal, nonprofit, and private sector actors to step in and fill that void that President Trump's announcement created. But of course, it's not just the US, and it's not just the US we're concerned about. We see non-state actors playing pervasive and important roles in shaping climate strategies everywhere. So in almost every state worldwide, an increasingly heterogeneous group of actors are shaping climate mitigation and adaptation efforts. So the idiosyncratic nature of the United States signaling its withdrawal from the Paris Agreement provides the frame for our discussion, because it does create a stark and urgent void. But our conversation here really is designed to be much broader and to look at the role of non-state actors worldwide. So with that frame, I want to just very briefly introduce our terrific panelists, and then we're going to have a conversation roundtable in a roundtable style. Okay, so our fantastic panelists. First, Sue Binyas. Sue, who I'm sure many of you know, is a senior fellow at the United Nations Foundation and a visiting scholar at Columbia Law School for more than 25 years. She served as the lead climate lawyer for the US State Department. In that capacity, she played a central role in all major international climate negotiations, including the Paris Agreement, which we will focus on today. And during her tenure at the State Department as a deputy legal advisor, she also supervised the Treaty Office and issues relating to law of the sea, Somali piracy, the Western Hemisphere, human rights, law enforcement, and private international law, so very siloed. No, kidding. Prior to that, she led the State Department's Legal Office for Oceans, Environment, and Science, as well as the Legal Office for European Affairs. Our next panelist is Jose Felix Pinto Basurco. Jose is a visiting scholar at the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law, and apparently they get to sit together and work together a lot, which is nice. His research focuses on the legal impacts in implementing the Paris Agreement in Latin American countries. He specializes in international environmental law and has experience in public administration, the private sector, and research. He's followed the international climate change process in different capacities, as a delegate, as a researcher, and for the UNFCCC Secretariat. And in 2015, the Alexander Humboldt Foundation awarded him a fellowship for his research on the implementation of international climate change law in developing countries. Next, we have down at the far end, we have Ashley Allen. Ashley's the Senior Manager for Climate and Land at Mars Corporation. She was previously at the US State Department, where she led a team that implemented the Low Emissions Development Strategies program to help developing countries around the world develop low-carbon solutions for economic growth. Before that, she was Acting Division Chief and Climate Change Specialist at USAID, where she led climate change programs and provided technical training, guiding, and oversight for USAID's $350 million per year global climate change initiative. And then last but not least, we have Sue Reed right here next to me. Sue is Vice President of Climate and Energy at Ceres, where she oversees the organization's climate and energy team, including electric power, transportation, oil and gas, and insurance. She also coordinates across the organization to advance Ceres' Clean Trillion campaign. The campaign promotes a clean energy investment target intending to avoid the worst effects of climate change, requiring more than $1 trillion additional investment in clean energy globally each year, while also, of course, ratcheting down investment in fossil fuels, which is something we need. So as you can just see from those very brief bios, the range of issues that these panelists have worked on, the parts of climate change law that they've touched is vast, and so terrific group. So first I want to just say thank you to all of you for being here and for being part of this conversation. So what I'd like to do is just begin with some opening framing questions. And Sue Binyas, we have two Sues, of course, we'll start with you. And I just wanted to ask if you could offer us kind of essential background, any essential thoughts you have on the structure and shifted paradigm that the Paris Agreement represents, having worked on it so intimately, and any particular implementation challenges and opportunities that the Paris Agreement presents. And then within that frame, or with that frame in place, if you could talk to us a little bit about the US decision to withdraw and what that's done in terms of mobilizing and prompting responses from non-state actors.
Okay, thank you so much. So the Paris Agreement sets up, many of you already know this, but it sets up a temperature goal of keeping the increase in global temperature to well below 2 degrees beyond pre-industrial levels. And then it sets up several mechanisms for achieving that goal. It starts with the, what's called the nationally determined contribution approach. That was something the US, an idea the US contributed to the process. It's kind of the opposite of the Kyoto Protocol, where emissions targets were negotiated. Here, every country comes up with its own commitment. And that served two purposes, really. It was to bring in all countries in the world. So you were no longer in a developed country only world, and you needed a way in which to get developing countries to come on board, and it was considered that a nationally determined approach would be the best way to do that. It also allowed the agreement to move beyond the Kyoto paradigm of developed countries do X and developing countries do Y, or not X in that case. So, nationally determined approach. There's also a strong transparency system under Paris, where countries are expected to report on their emissions and the progress they're making in meeting their commitments, and there's a review system, and that's still being elaborated. Now, a core aspect of the agreement is a regular review of how the world is doing, and that's called the global stocktake, and it takes place every 5 years, and there's supposed to be a kind of assessment of where we are and what more needs to be done, and being informed by that review, each country is supposed to go home and then update its nationally determined contribution. They're encouraged to be more ambitious, but that's not a legally binding requirement. Okay, so that's the essence of the Paris Agreement. Now, in the run-up to Paris, there was a big push for Paris, or what I call Greater Metropolitan Paris, because it's not necessarily the agreement itself, but sort of the larger Paris outcome, to enable non-state actors to reflect their own commitments. And France was a big proponent of this. They called this Pillar 4 of the Paris outcome. And they gave a couple reasons, and I would say that other non-state actors had additional reasons, and I would boil them down to 3. One was that it would be useful to show broadened engagement, quote unquote, that unlike the Kyoto days, where it was largely an intergovernmental affair and no one else really kind of vocally taking part, you would show that cities, states, businesses, et cetera, were actively engaged in the climate challenge. Another motivation, and this might have been particularly on France's part, was they kind of knew that the targets were going to end up being non-legally binding, both because of the United States and China and major developing countries, and they wanted a way to bolster the credibility of national pledges. So they thought it would be helpful if you had sub-state or sub-national actors taking on commitments. Then, for example, if the US took on a commitment of X and California took on a commitment of X minus 5, and it's a substantial portion of U.S. commitments, it would help people sort of be reassured that the U.S. was actually going to live up to its commitment, but we can talk about that later. The third motivation was that it would send a signal to the marketplace that the transformation to kind of decarbonization was irreversible. So those are the motivations. There was a small sort of academic component that was arguing that subnational actors should also be able to formally join the Paris Agreement. That wasn't something that was supported by states, certainly not by the US, and that was really more of kind of a sideshow. So the agreement doesn't break new ground in any, I think, international law, kind of treaty sense. You still have to be a state with a capital S or a regional economic integration organization in order to join. But the broader outcome, I would say, is pretty unusual in its emphasis on the engagement of non-state actors, or what we now call, under the Paris Agreement, non-party stakeholders. That was a negotiation in itself. What to call them? Some people didn't like the word sub. It sounded kind of inferior. It also didn't really capture companies, so non-party stakeholders is sort of a catch-all for kind of all of the above. Now, the United States supported this so-called Pillar 4, having no idea how important it was going to be ultimately, a couple of years down the road. I mean, we supported it just for the reasons that I already mentioned. So the basic bottom line is that Paris generated a number of ways for non-state actors or non-party stakeholders to participate, engage, although not formally join. I'll give a couple examples. A year before Paris, when Peru hosted the Conference of the Parties, they set up a portal that they called the Nazca Portal that allows non-state actors, regions, cities, states, companies, to kind of reflect a commitment. It could be a mitigation commitment, it could be an adaptation commitment, in this portal. It now has over 12,000 commitments, and an interesting map. If you go onto that portal, you can sort of click on Coca-Cola and see what its commitments are, or you can click on California and see what its commitments are, and so you can look at regions, you can look at particular companies, so it's instructive and interesting. They also came up with this concept a year before Paris of the so-called action agenda, and that was kind of a catch-all for bolstering the engagement and participation of all kinds of non-state actors on the margins of the Paris process. There are high-level events, there are various activities, and so forth. Now, fast forward to June 1st of last year, and the Trump announcement of the intention to withdraw. You've probably all heard that that is not, I mean, many people think we already withdrew, but technically speaking, that's not true. You can't even initiate the withdrawal process because of the withdrawal clause until November 2019, and you have an additional year before it takes effect. There's kind of a perception that subnational actors in the United States all reacted in response to the Trump announcement, but that's not quite true. Many of them were already taking action sort of just on climate grounds. Before that announcement, there had already been in the run-up to Paris something that the White House encouraged, which was American business acts on climate. There were several types of business commitments. But it's fair to say that that type of action literally exploded, or maybe figuratively exploded, the day, June 1st, or at least June 2nd, after the announcement, and the momentum has only increased since then. Now, some of it takes the form of just individual cities, states, companies expressing some kind of support. That support might be very general. It might be just, we support the Paris Agreement. Or it might be more specifically, we support the target, the specific emissions target that the Obama administration submitted. Only one state that I'm aware of has actually enacted a law kind of codifying support for the Paris Agreement, and that's Hawaii. Now, the two, if you're going to remember nothing else, I would remember the two collective initiatives that sprung up around June 1st and June 2nd of last year. One is just made up of states, and that's the U.S. Climate Alliance. And I believe it has 16 states plus Puerto Rico at the moment, and it adds up to a pretty substantial amount of U.S. GDP, population, et cetera. And that U.S. Climate Alliance is devoted to the Paris Agreement and meeting the U.S. target within the territories of those particular states. Obviously, they have no control over meeting the U.S. target outside their own territories. Now, the other group is a lot broader than just states. It includes states, cities, universities, companies, et cetera, and that's the We Are Still In coalition. At the conference last year, and Ashley helped organize this, along with M&Ms that said we are still in. They organized a pavilion at the Conference of the Parties that was probably larger than any country's pavilion, so it was quite impressive. Anyway, apart from We Are Still In and the U.S. Climate Alliance, you have various state and city arrangements with other kind of counterparts, and also with other countries, which we may talk to a little bit later in this panel, which is kind of an interesting development. And the last thing I'll mention is that California, as Jerry Brown leaves his governorship, they are hosting a very major climate conference in September of this year, focusing on, there may be some countries there, but focusing largely on non-state action. Thanks.
Thanks. So with the Paris frame laid out and then complicated by the Trump administration announcement, complicated in positive and negative ways, let's widen the frame back out to the international level, and I'll ask Jose to discuss the extent to which the Paris Agreement is being implemented by non-state actors in Latin America and more broadly in developing countries. And I know you have a lot of expertise in this area, so in particular, are there any apparent trends or any key challenges that have characterized the evolving role of non-state actors outside the U.S., whether within a domestic context or in a transnational context?
Thank you very much. So I was discussing the different challenges developed and developing countries have with Subinias before entering this room. And it is interesting to highlight that while developed countries like the US have all the means to take action on climate change, their politicians are discussing if climate change is a priority or not. While developing countries, even if they wanted to take action towards climate change, they don't have always the necessary means to do that, because they don't have the necessary institutional arrangements, they don't have the necessary regulatory means, and also there is an issue about capacity building. Not all developing countries have this problem, but many do. So maybe because of this, most actions regarding climate change in developing countries are done through projects that are financed through cooperation agreements or financed through multilateral banks. So some of these projects are made or carried out by non-state actors. So if there is actions in developing countries that are carried out by non-state actors, the goal is that these actions contribute to achieving that country's NDC, which is the nationally determined contribution, which Sue mentioned and explained. So one challenge here is that these developing countries may lack a centralized system which directs how non-state actors are carrying out these climate actions, and also a monitoring system that can take account or measure what the results are of these actions, so they can see how they contribute to the national determined contributions. So I am not sure how many countries have such a system in place, including developed and developing countries. But there is one good example very recently that comes from Peru, which is my country. The Peruvian parliament recently approved a national climate change framework law. And this is a big step towards climate protection in Peru. It's a great example for a developing country towards climate protection. And it has many, many positive additions. And one of these additions is an express mention of non-state actors in public decision making. So the way this works is through two ways it works. The first is that non-state actors will participate in decision making through a national commission. This national commission is in charge of creating and updating the nationally determined contribution. And the second way is directed specifically to indigenous peoples and local communities. And the way this works is that indigenous peoples, organizations, and local communities are included in this climate change decision making through a prior consent system, which was created in Peru and based on ILO Convention 169. So if this system works in Peru, including non-state actors in public decision-making through this commission and through this participation of indigenous peoples, it could be a very positive way in which non-state actors can contribute to a country's NDC and thus contributing to achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement.
Thank you. So now that we've framed very broadly some of the patterns we're seeing with respect to the role of non-state actors, both domestically and in an international context, just kind of scratching at the surface of that conversation, Ashley, could you talk to us a little bit about the role multinational corporations can and are playing with respect to addressing climate change generally, but also more specifically with respect to implementing the Paris Agreement? And then once you've kind of talked about that general role, perhaps you could add a little bit about the response that you've seen following President Trump's announcement and the degree to which, if any, that's influenced both Mars's behavior but other corporations that maybe you work with.
Sure, thanks, Cinnamon. And first, let me just say how honored I am to be on this panel. When I was part of the climate team at State, and I see some familiar faces in the audience, and I'm sure you'll agree with me, Sue Biniaz was kind of the keeper of all knowledge related to international climate law and all of the inner workings of the UNFCCC process. So it's really an honor to be up here with so many climate leaders that have been leading this work for a long time. And I'm not a lawyer, so also if anyone, I hope you'll ask me some good questions about Mars, but if you ask me any hard legal questions, I'll kind of use what my go-to was back when I was at State, which is I defer to Sue. I guess Mars Incorporated, we're on this panel kind of representing all multinational corporations, which you can imagine doesn't quite work. It's a very broad field of companies coming from many different perspectives. But really, overall, companies are getting more and more pressure to address climate change head on and to be outspoken about what we're doing on climate change. And that pressure is coming from the investment community, but it's also coming from, in the manufacturing side, from some of our big customers like Walmart, to some extent from consumers, and then, really just from pressure within our supply chains. If you think about Mars, we're a privately owned, a family company, but we're a $35 billion small family company, and we have supply chains throughout the world in over 80 countries. And over the last several years, we have very much seen the impacts of climate change, whether that be through decreased yields in some of the crops that we source, such as cocoa, for example, in West Africa, more areas of water stress in some of our supply chains, for example, in rice production, a lot of water stress in areas where rice is produced. So it really shows up in our day-to-day business operations and in how we source the ingredients that we need to make our products. So I think with those different pressures in mind, over the last few years, the conversation about climate change in the corporate world has really moved away from the kind of good PR, corporate social responsibility conversation to really what do we need to do to change our business practices so that we can actually continue to be an economically viable and economically successful business in future decades. And that's really how Mars looks at the issue. We look at it as part of our long-term sustainability, and we're able to kind of take a very long-term perspective because of our structure and the way that the family ownership drives the priorities of the business. As a food company, in order to meet a challenge like climate change, we really want to drive transformation throughout the agricultural sector, not just within our own operations. So it's pretty easy for us to figure out how much energy we use in our 420 plus sites around the world, our 420 plus factories and offices around the world, and then purchase renewable electricity through various different contractual mechanisms to meet those needs. But that just covers our operations. And ultimately, when you think about a company's carbon footprint, at least for us, our operations are only around less than 10% of our total footprint. Whereas our agricultural supply chain actually makes up nearly half of our footprint. And if you add in land use change, so the estimated effects that agriculture has on, for example, deforestation, that makes up 75% of our footprint. So really, we're talking about a huge interconnected network that we have some influence over, but that we don't control. And that, I think, is the real challenge for companies that are getting into this space. The way this connects to the broader international policy regime is through, I think, kind of the measurement and targets aspect. So if I look at our climate journey at Mars, it was basically through 3 steps. The first step, just even mapping what our value chains were, what our carbon footprint was, which takes a lot more data than we usually compile, with a lot more level of detail as all the way down to the farmer level where possible, and all the way up to the consumer level. And so that itself is a real challenge and a big journey. And then the second step then is translating that mapping effort into a carbon number through various methodologies that are well established now for companies, and then turning that into a target. And the target piece is, I think, for us, the biggest link with the Paris Agreement, and that's true for, I think, a number of companies. There was an initiative that was launched a few years ago called the Science-Based Targets Initiative, and it was launched by World Resources Institute, WWF, CDP, there's a few others that cooperate on that, and that really was meant to help companies translate their emissions and their sort of goals around climate change into a target that could in some way kind of add up to what the Paris Agreement set as what, you know, the globe should hit in order to keep global warming in check. So in order to hit that 2-degree goal, translating that into individual company targets. Now you can imagine there's a whole host of different ways that you could do that, and in fact, I think the Science-Based Targets Initiative has like 7 accepted methodologies or something like that, one of which we helped drive. But the idea being that as a company, you can, at least with some confidence, figure out what's your kind of fair share in helping the world meet that target. So for Mars, when we figured out our carbon footprint, we determined to our best guess that it was 26.2 million tons of CO2 in 2015, and that, oh, I just said 26, 260, and that is around the same as the country of Panama. So it's kind of in line, and it sort of gave us a reference point that if a company can have the similar footprint as a country, then certainly we should accept responsibility for addressing that footprint and taking action on that. We set a goal then to cut that footprint by 27% by 2025 and by 67% by 2050, with the idea that kind of setting this very long-term aspirational goal keeps the goals of the Paris Agreement in our sights and sort of keeps us moving in a direction toward increasing ambition toward reducing CO2. The third step in that whole journey then is implementation. So how do you actually achieve a goal like that? And I think this is the stage that a lot of companies that have set these goals, so there are over 300 companies have committed to set a science-based target, and we talk with many of them on, through various forums on a daily basis. So, you know, we're working with Walmart, we're working with Kellogg's and General Mills and Nestle and Danone, who owns Danone, and we're all kind of working through the same issues of how does this translate into action within our supply chains, and how can we influence things that is happening, you know, 4 tiers away from our actual operations. And it looks different in every single supply chain. It looks different for cocoa than it looks for beef or for corn or for soy. But I think the link with policy there is that we're having an increasing appreciation for is how important it is that country goals and the country NDCs line up with what we're trying to achieve. And so that when we're trying to reduce our emissions in our cocoa supply chain by getting rid of deforestation pressures in West Africa, that the governments of Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana are on board with us and are also implementing and enforcing the policies that they've set. So there's a lot of interlinkages there, and particularly in the agriculture side, I think national policy plays a really huge role. So the last thing I'll just say, since you mentioned the administration's announcement, and then Sue mentioned the We Are Still In campaign, for us, you know, we had already have this body of work ongoing, and the We Are Still In campaign gave us a little more of an organizing platform to kind of express a bit of an advocacy message related to our work. Historically, we haven't been very kind of advocacy oriented. We haven't been very vocal in advocating for certain policies over others or anything like that. But that announcement flipped a bit of a switch within Mars to say kind of, hey, wait a minute, this is no longer in line with the direction we're trying to go and with what we see is the right thing to do. And so that gave us a way to kind of join with others and say, here's what we're already doing, and this is why it's important to us. And so regardless of what happens in the US in the policy landscape, we are still in this effort. We are still going to move toward these goals. And I think that that's had a powerful message internationally in giving people confidence that there isn't just sort of one voice in the US. It really is, there really are multiple movements geared toward taking action on climate change.
Thank you. So, Sue, having heard from Ashley a bit about the evolving role of big multinational corporations in addressing climate change, and more specifically about what Mars is doing in this context, and a little bit about the partnerships that they have and how they're quantifying their footprint, could you talk to us, kind of broaden the lens a bit, and discuss what you see as the larger and evolving role of the private sector in implementing the Paris Agreement, and similarly some of the challenges and opportunities that non-state actors are beginning to face, both generally but also within the context of the President Trump's announcement and then the response with the We're Still In campaign.
Certainly, and I'd like to echo the words of appreciation for joining this esteemed panel and sophisticated audience today. I think it might be helpful just to say a word about my organization, because it's a rather unusual creature in the nonprofit space in that we're a nonprofit and we work to mobilize private sector leadership on sustainability solutions. So we coordinate the investor network on climate risk and sustainability that has about 150 institutional investors of all different stripes with about 24 trillion in assets under management. We coordinate 2 different business networks, a core company network, about 60 mostly Fortune 500 companies that we're working with on 20 different sustainability criteria to move them toward leadership on environmental, social, and governance criteria. And then we have the BICEP network, Business for Innovative Climate and Energy Policy, about 45 mostly consumer-facing brands that have come together on a regular basis working with Ceres to elevate their voices in support of strong climate and energy policies. So it's with that context and associated lenses that I offer some thoughts and remarks today. So, you know, the history here, I think it's important to go back to the run-up to the Paris Agreement in terms of private sector mobilization just a bit more deeply, because that's been crucial in terms of this context. We and many of our partners around the world, and working with companies like Mars and many others, in addition to the investor community and global investor coalition partners, worked to send a clarion signal to governments around the world that the Paris Agreement and the structure of it that was brilliant with the NDCs, and almost in each according to their own approach for country by country contributions to an overarching framework that set very clear direction on global temperature rise limits, was crucial for creating a roadmap and predictability. And so we and other partners around the world mobilized business and investor leadership around this. And so it's important to take stock of the policy driver role. I think it's much more talked about often, the policy inertia and efforts of entrenched interest to maintain the status quo in terms of global carbon-intensive energy supplies, in terms of that influence on policy. But the policy driver role of those who are looking at the long-term time horizon, that lens in terms of business and economic resilience, and calling for these policy regimes to be in place, has played a really crucial role. And it was central to the Paris Agreement. It also was essential in terms of all that groundwork that was laid, the engagement of non-state actors. And I'm focused on companies and investors in terms of my remarks, because those are the constituencies we work with. Absolutely the role of states and cities and academic institutions and faith organizations and tribes and so on have all played a crucial role as well. I don't mean to discount any of those contributions, but you know, with a particular focus on the business and investor community, having spent all of that time and energy in the build-up to the Paris Agreement, it was striking that when the 2006 US election happened, only about 3 business days later, hundreds of company and investor leaders raised their voices at the Marrakesh climate talks at COP22, that these are massive institutions, that they were able to run their own internal traps and navigate bureaucracies and decision-making and so forth. That could not have happened without real buy-in in terms of an understanding of the risks and opportunities and the importance of staying the course on the Paris Agreement. So only a few days after that election at Marrakesh, we heard in spades that it was crucial, and Mars was right there at the table. It was crucial for these hundreds of private sector leaders to elevate their voices under, at that time, the moniker Business Backs Low Carbon USA, and it was about calling on new leadership to stay the course. And that, coupled with the Climate Vulnerable Forum, 40-odd of the most climate vulnerable nations in the world, seizing that moment while the world was on tenterhooks, not knowing where the US was going to go in the wake of this election, stepping up and committing to moving to 100% renewable energy in short order. That 1-2 punch has been pointed to frequently as having been crucial to staying the course and providing some assurances that Paris Agreement implementation would move forward almost irrespective of what happened stateside from a federal policy leadership perspective. Fast forward then to the June 1 announcement by the Trump administration, which, by the way, came on the heels of a May 30th annual general meeting at Exxon, where for the first time in the history of that company, there was a majority vote on a shareholder resolution, and it was on a climate resolution calling on the company to do 2-degree scenario analysis, a really strong signal from investors, from the private sector, that they need to take these issues into their own hands. We have to make progress on this. And then a few days after the withdrawal announcement by the Trump administration, hundreds of companies, this time under the moniker We Are Still In, companies, universities, states, cities, investors, and so on, coming forward to say that we, collectively, the royal we, are going to stay the course. So it was rhetorical, but also backed by real action. And that's the third key element that I'd like to touch on, that both because of the more palpable risks. I mean, it's a sobering reality. At the same time, it provides some comfort in staying power that companies like Mars are motivated to act in part because the physical, tangible impacts of climate change already are so widespread, already affecting supply chains. So that gives comfort that they're staying power because companies are waking up to this as something that affects their bottom lines. It also creates an extraordinary sense of urgency, of course, both because of that and because we've seen an extraordinary transition in terms of the cost competitiveness of clean energy, of renewable energy like wind and solar. Now storage is on a similar trajectory, that companies, based often just on the economics, on the business case, not necessarily on what we laud as leadership from Mars, looking at its proportional contributions globally and an element of moral and other imperative. Based on the basic business case, companies are stepping up like never before to go to 100% renewable energy, not just for their own operations, but for their supply chains, doubling their energy efficiency or productivity, beginning to commit to transform their fleets to electrified vehicles, other low-carbon transportation, setting science-based targets for emissions reductions across their enterprise. And that's because, like never before, they understand, or there's growing understanding in the private sector, that these risks are real, they're material, they're financial, they have to be addressed. And also that in clean energy transition, there's tremendous opportunity. And so we can hopefully dig into this a bit more in the dialogue on this panel. But there needs to be much more rapid evolution in terms of both how investors look at their fiduciary obligations, because we're talking about a level of transformation in terms of completely upending business as usual on energy reliance and systems like the world has never seen in any context in terms of scale, in terms of urgency, and in terms of how widespread this transition and transformation needs to be. And the law and the understanding of fiduciary obligations on the part of investors needs to catch up to that. We're beginning to see that. And in terms of companies, addressing what the G20's created financial stability, the G20 Financial Stability Board's Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, spearheaded by Mark Carney, also the governor of the Bank of England, refers to as the tragedy of the horizons, that changing the timelines at which private sector actors look at climate risks and opportunities is another crucial challenge here, where we're beginning to see movement, beginning to see changes that are crucial in the various regulatory contexts, and some really strong underpinnings for the action that we need to realize the objectives of the Paris Agreement.
Thank you. So perhaps kind of stepping back and asking a large-scale governance question, which I think a lot of people have wondered about. And Sue, I'll direct this to you initially and then ask if others have thoughts. But can you talk a little bit about why the diplomatic reaction to Trump's announcement has been more muted than we might have expected, and what this might indicate about other forms of policy drivers or other forms of alternative diplomacy that we're starting to see, not necessarily displacing state to state, but certainly becoming much more complementary mechanisms in governance formation?
Sure. Yeah, so people are often asking, why isn't there more diplomatic blowback? I was one of the people who said there would be a lot of diplomatic blowback to an announcement pulling out of Paris, and that's probably because I lived through Kyoto. And I agree that it's been much less than expected. I mean, if you compare the Kyoto and Paris situation, it's completely counterintuitive, right? Because during Kyoto times, climate change was much less of an issue in the world. There was sort of less science, fewer impacts. It was understandable why the US might not have embraced the Kyoto Protocol. It had a stringent target. It didn't have any developing countries in it. Even President Clinton had not sent it up to the Senate because of the deficiency in, what was perceived as, missing developing countries. You had the Byrd-Hagel resolution, 95-0 in the Senate, saying don't even think about bringing home an agreement that doesn't include developing countries and that would harm the US economy. So there were all these reasons why it should have been fairly predictable that the Bush administration would, not eagerly embrace Kyoto, and yet it was raised just constantly and consistently after the Bush administration announcement. It was kind of became an albatross around the neck of the administration as they tried to get cooperation from other countries on other issues. So you would think it would be much more in the case of the Paris Agreement, right? Because climate change is much more of an issue now. There's much more public awareness, more science, more impacts, and most importantly, the Paris Agreement accommodated, I would say all, but even if you didn't think all, you might say most of the problems that the United States raised with the Kyoto Protocol. So the rest of the world went out of its way to accommodate issues that have been raised by the US. And so when you walk away from that, you'd think other countries would be completely screaming. So why not? I mean, here's my theory. First of all, with the Trump administration, I just think there are so many priority issues that other countries have, to raise that, how often and for which countries would climate rise to the very top? It's not like the olden days where climate might have risen to the top because there weren't as many other things to raise. I think France is pretty much an exception, maybe because they're just, more closely tethered to the Paris Agreement, or they have more confidence in the ability to raise issues. But they're about almost the only one that's at least talking about it publicly. I think reason number two is that there's probably fear that it might be counterproductive or provocative to talk about the Paris Agreement, and President Trump left, maybe not a door, but like a small window open for possibly either not withdrawing or rejoining the agreement, and maybe people are worried about if they raise it too much, that door or window may close. But I think the third reason, which relates to non-state actors, is that other countries are kind of looking past the federal government at what the United States is doing at the city-state business level, and kind of seeing that as the substitute for, so there's less need to yell at the federal government because there's actually other actors to go talk to. And I think of this as kind of an alternative diplomacy is what I'm thinking it might be called, because they're taking maybe the rage and anger or hostility or whatever that they would otherwise be directing at the federal government, and then they're just like transferring that energy to sort of cooperative or productive relationships with cities, states, businesses, et cetera. And a couple examples would be, you had a climate kind of meeting and outcome between President Xi of China and Jerry Brown of California. That's not very normal diplomatic activity, especially for China, which is very protocol-oriented. This is anecdotal, but you have visits from foreign officials who work on climate coming to Washington and not meeting with the administration, but you hear that they've met with NGOs, companies, and think tanks, et cetera. You have this extraordinary North American statement that I have a copy of here. You know, it might have been normal before these days for some, you know, one ministry of another country to maybe enter into some kind of agreement with some, or non-binding, of course, statement with a U.S. state or something like that. But here you have at the you know, top level, Canada, Mexico, and the U.S. Climate Alliance, which is the 16 or 17 states that I mentioned, entering into, you know, a kind of statement of cooperation on climate change. That means somebody in Canada and Mexico at the prime minister or presidential level decided it was perfectly fine to enter into a statement with 16 or 17 states in the United States. I think that's pretty extraordinary. And then you've got all these bilateral arrangements that, you know, Canada and other states have entered into with counterparts or, you know, actual countries, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll stop there, but that's at least my theory of the case. Thanks.
Thanks. I'd welcome thoughts any other the panelists have if you'd like to weigh in. Okay, so we definitely want to leave time for questions, but before we move to audience question, I think there's another area that we wanted to at least touch upon, which of course is to broaden our conversation beyond mitigation to think about the other pillars of the Paris Agreement when we're talking about implementation, and in particular to think about adaptation and loss and damage, and also really kind of climate finance issues. Because of course, as international climate change laws developed, we've begun to see the equal importance of thinking about adaptation. And so I would just like to invite our panelists to kind of weigh in with their thoughts about the role of non-state actors, private sector, sub-federal actors within the adaptation context more particularly, both within the context of the Trump administration, but just more generally because I think that we've seen this is an area where non-state actors are increasingly important. And Jose, I don't know, maybe I'd ask you to start with kind of a wider lens. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you. So, of course, adapting to climate change is a great challenge, especially for developing countries, but also here I see that in the U.S. there are many actions taken towards adaptation, which is considered very important. I think that mostly adaptation actions are carried out by subnational governments, by local municipalities. So they need direction. I think I mentioned this before. They need the direction of the national government in order to know what the priorities towards adaptation are. So you have to have climate change policies in place, maybe laws, a framework law like the one I mentioned before from Peru is a huge step towards that, because it can include climate change into public spending. It can include the environmental impact assessment be made, including climate change into environmental impact assessments. It's also one of the key issues where adaptation can become effective. So the big challenge is to have this, to have a central government that can direct a little bit, direct what actions should be made. And this is, of course, a huge challenge. I also mentioned this before in developing countries, because there is many developing countries lack this kind of direction. But also, I see this as also a challenge in other countries where the priority of climate change is discussed in a political level and not at a technical level. So the big issue related to adaptation to climate change is, of course, financing this adaptation. And so in order for financing to go towards actions that are effective towards climate change, there has to be an adequate institutional arrangements, regulatory frameworks, and this is the main challenge for developing countries, to have this set in place.
Yeah, and maybe I can just add on to that. I mean, I think for most companies, the conversation on adaptation is much more nascent than on mitigation. We've been really focusing on counting carbon and think it's like a big win that we can, kind of count our carbon footprint. That seems so novel, and so that's really where the focus has been. But that said, I mean, there's been an increasing emphasis on climate risk and resilience, particularly through, as Sue mentioned, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure that's been resonating and kind of blowing up among the corporate disclosure community. And even though that really is focused on publicly traded companies, it really reaches all of us because those of us that want to be visible and active on climate change report through all sorts of different disclosure mechanisms, but particularly the CDP. It used to be called the Climate Disclosure Program, now it's just called CDP. And this year, that is not, it used to really focus on a company's emissions and actions related to deforestation and things like that. And this year, it's expanded to also talk about climate risk and where are there areas of risk exposure within your value chains and what are you doing about it. So we've, you know, companies, of course, have a really extensive body of work on risk in general within their business. And then I think what we're kind of all working through now is how do you integrate climate-related concerns into that. And I also wanted to make sure I thanked Sue and Ceres because they really help us think through a lot of these issues and give us the advice on what are the implications for some of these things that kind of pop up there and put pressure on companies to either disclose on something or to act on a particular policy arena. And they really give us the kind of guidance that we need to figure out how to do that.
Well, thank you for those kind words. And I'd love to add a couple other elements. One is that we try, well, this isn't possible in every context nor as far-reaching as is needed. We look for as many sort of twofer opportunities where mitigation solutions also are good for promoting resilience and adaptation. So distributed clean energy, for example. And you see, you know, around the world, the disruption in electric power supply from these increasingly intense storm events, for example. And a lot of it is theoretical because we have so many centralized grids where we have existing electric power supply around the world. But there's good reason to believe with more distributed clean energy grids that you would see a lot less disruption in the wake of these kinds of impacts. Another element I wanted to touch on is just one further element on the TCFD that Ashley pointed us back to. And that's that these recommendations are really important. If you're not familiar with them, they came out in June of last year. The task force itself is an industry-led task force. Mark Carney from Bank of England and the Financial Stability Board and Mike Bloomberg played central roles spearheading this. And they focus on 3 different kinds of risks. So transition risks and where your business and investment plans, how they are stress tested against a world that is rapidly decarbonizing and shifting these systems. Physical risks, so this is the piece that most directly ties to adaptation. So how are you getting out ahead of existing and projected climate impacts that are occurring on the ground? And then liability risks, especially for those companies and investors that have significant exposure in terms of high carbon resources. So the TCFD recommendations can be an extraordinarily useful tool. They're just in the process of being rolled out and sort of socialized now, for lack of a better term, but different jurisdictions around the world. The EU has been a real leader. The French government, UK government have already led the way in terms of integration of these recommendations into existing legal and regulatory regimes, and we expect to see a lot more of that extending even to quasi-regulatory bodies like stock exchanges, for example, around listing standards. And the last piece I wanted to touch on, and these things don't seem logically connected other than that they all have an adaptation element, but one area that is really under-discussed from what we've been exposed to is that based on good logic, good economics, the credit rating agencies have started to move down the path of adjusting the sovereign credit ratings of the most climate vulnerable countries in the world. These are countries that have contributed the least to the problem, and in virtually every instance can least afford the capital that is needed for both adaptation and mitigation. And now we'll have an even greater challenge because the cost of capital will be higher because their their credit ratings have been modified. And again, there is good economic logic behind that, in that the risks actually are greater. But there is a huge need from a moral and ethical and societal standpoint. We're all in this in terms of solving climate change, for that gross inequity to be addressed through some sort of policy reform, some sort of systems that account for that. Might also be addressed in part through public finance institutions, multilateral development banks, the Green Climate Fund, and so on. But really needs to be elevated in the public discourse and problem solving.
Thanks. I just wanted to say something about finance as opposed to adaptation, because right after the president's announcement about Paris, part of the announcement, as Cinnamon said, was not just we're going to withdraw from Paris, but also we're not going to pay, the GCF. And so the Obama pledge had been $3 billion, and they paid $1 billion of it before the end of the administration. So that left kind of a $2 billion gap. So a couple of us in kind of parallel universes started thinking, well, wait, the We Are Still In and U.S. Climate Alliance, they're all about mitigation and reducing emissions. So we were thinking, well, shouldn't there be sort of a functional equivalent on the finance side? I mean, you're never going to make up $2 billion through people's contributions. But the idea was just to show some goodwill and solidarity, I guess, for developing countries. So that's something I've been working on with between UN Foundation, Center for American Progress, and World Resources Institute. And there are a number of kind of legal and other issues, but you have to figure out, is this a sub-national governmental fund? Do you find a city or a state that's willing to sponsor that kind of a fund if you're not going to get money from the federal government? Or do you make it a nonprofit as the center? Now, you also have to figure out, where does the money go? Do you pick the GCF? Is that, will people be more will Americans, have they ever heard of the GCF? Will they want to put money into the GCF? There's a lot of appeal to adaptation, especially among faith-based groups, which are the organizations that have expressed, one of the groups that have expressed interest in putting money into this kind of a thing. Do you give money to the adaptation fund? Is it sort of 50-50 mitigation, adaptation? The way the GCF is structured, it can accept money from not just governments, but non-government, but they have to have guidelines in place in order to do so. And so by putting all your eggs in the GCF basket, if you set yourself up at a nonprofit, you might not be able to make your contribution if you don't get the board of the GCF to go along with it. The UN Foundation has already set up an arrangement with the Adaptation Fund so that you can just go on the website and make your contribution. So anyway, people are working on this set of issues in order to have kind of something to show on the finance side.
Great, thank you. So maybe ask each of you very quickly to comment on one thing, and then we'll open it up for questions. So a lot of this conversation is focused on the positive role that non-state actors can play in implementing the Paris Agreement and addressing climate change. And I think that that's really important given the complex world we live in and the void that we have in terms of state action. But of course, with the deformalization of law and lawmaking processes and this kind of increased role for non-state actors, we have concerns about everything from fragmentation, democracy deficits, the reliability of commitments, et cetera. So I was just wondering if each of you could share what you think of as the thing that is the biggest challenge. It doesn't even have to be negative, but the biggest challenge with that kind of deformalization and the increased reliance on non-state actors in this context. And anybody can go first.
All right, I'll go first. I mean, to me, the biggest challenge is just where we're going to keep going. We're going to continue to go ahead and work toward our targets and take action on climate change. But the biggest challenge, I think, for me is, we can move faster when the policy frameworks in countries where we work are aligned with what we're doing. And so where they're not aligned, or where those forces aren't also pushing in the same direction, we only have so much influence. So I think it takes longer then. So that, to me, is the biggest challenge.
Well, I think the challenge is that even if cities, states, businesses in the United States all added up to the Obama target, it doesn't add up to a present United States as a country. So the atmosphere might feel the same because it's getting the same emission reductions, but it was absolutely critical in getting the Paris Agreement and all the nationally determined contributions that rolled in, which is like 186 even before the Paris conference started, that there was very strong President and Secretary of State using a huge amount of diplomatic muscle to get a result. And so even if you have cities and states doing the functional equivalent of the reductions, you don't have the country able to, push and cajole other countries. You don't have the sort of U.S.-China component that we had that was so critical to getting Paris, et cetera, et cetera. Thanks.
I completely agree. I think the challenge is that even if there is a will by non-state actors to contribute towards climate change protection, there has to be the right policy that is aligned to make it possible to contribute to this. So yeah, I think there has to be some kind of direction through policy or through regulation put in place in order to facilitate this.
I was going to shy away from responding because you explicitly asked for pithy responses, and I tend to speak in paragraphs, but I'll try. So I would add that we did some analysis we put out almost 2 years ago with Bloomberg New Energy Finance, just focused on the electric power sector. And even with the extraordinarily favorable economics and clean energy beginning to outcompete fossil energy around the world, and by 2020 projected to do so almost everywhere, there is still a gap between projections for business as usual investment in clean energy and what we actually need to achieve a climate stabilization scenario. And the only way to close that gap, it has to be with policies. There are incredible existing market distortions in terms of direct and indirect subsidies for fossil fuels. So it's not a level playing field. So the private sector alone simply can't get there without significant additional government action policy reform. And the private sector also is just not as accountable, right? Look what has just happened in the United States with the federal fuel efficiency and vehicle fuel economy standards. The very automakers who were at the table supporting these standards back when they were first adopted are now squarely taking aim at them. And that's in part because these systems in terms of fiduciary obligations and time horizons around business and investment planning haven't caught up to where we need to be on climate. And the TCFD recommendations and other tools will help us get there. But right now, the private sector doesn't even have the tools or the accountability to society to get us there. So we can revel in, as we should, the actions that increasingly are being taken that at a minimum will help bridge the gap as we have policy and other uncertainty, especially in the United States right now. But there is an acute need for further policy action that many of these private sector actors can support, but it needs to happen.
Thank you. So we have a few minutes left, and we want to be sure that we have give everyone who has a question the chance to ask. So if we could begin to take questions. I think we have mics here and here, so that's not super convenient. But yes, please.
Hi, thank you. So a question to Ashley. Following what Sue Reed was saying about why companies actually take these efforts to reduce their footprint. And I wanted to ask you in your previous caps, I guess, not as a representative of Mars, but how do you explain this? Obviously, some people within the company might care, but why would the company care?
Yeah. It's definitely different for every company, and Mars is kind of unique because we have this private ownership, and we have an owning family, the Mars family, that deeply cares about these issues and sees this as part of how they continue to keep the company growing for the next generation. So the Mars family is always thinking about what's the next Mars family generation that's going to be leading this growing company. So that's a little unique, but I think for all companies, there's been a couple of very important economic trends that just make the business case make sense. So we all kind of started with our electricity portfolios and our operations, and for those of us that made 100% renewable energy goals and things like that, we've been able to develop power purchase agreements and other types of contractual arrangements that actually get us the power cheaper than if we did the traditional purchase off the grid. So that was like a really powerful business signal that gave our leadership confidence to kind of go further. And then it's a little more difficult to quantify, but they can sort of conceptualize the fact that if we're seeing disruptions within our supply chain, so particularly with agricultural commodities, we understand that we can't say like this piece was because of climate change and this piece wasn't, but we can definitely see that the overarching trend is more of these kinds of weather and drought and other kinds of disruptions, and that has a financial impact on us, even if it's hard to quantify exactly what that is. So it's sort of, as long as you're a company that can take that longer term view and that bigger picture view, then it just makes sense to take action to prevent those kinds of disruptions and do whatever you can to kind of shore up those supplies.
All right, we'll take a question here.
Okay. Hi, I'm Alexia Marks from the University of Colorado Law School, and sorry, my question's also for Ashley, and probably a little bit for Sue Reed as well. So for big multinationals like Mars, if you could list some examples of some of the more successful mechanisms that you use to influence the agricultural supply chain, I'd be interested to know what some of those might be, either grants to farmers or what type of kind of leveraging you make with that supply chain. And I guess secondly is if you see a role for any private third-party certification mechanisms getting involved in this as well. As I know there's some private certifications coming up with regenerative agriculture, with Dan and Wave and Patagonia and other big companies jumping on board that. So thank you.
Yeah, and I'm sure Sue has some really good examples, so definitely we'll turn to you. I think the question's still out there. I don't think anyone sort of figured out exactly what the most successful mechanisms are. Certifications are a huge part of it. That's the first path we all went down to try to reduce deforestation, right, with some success, but also some question on whether that's actually influencing deforestation rates. So while certification is absolutely part of the picture, one thing that we've been focused on, as both for existing certifications and as new certifications start to come about, is really what is the metrics that those certifications are measuring, not just sort of like it's a sustainable commodity, but how is it sustainable? What are the actual tons of CO2 that it is reducing? Because otherwise it's really tough to figure out what the result is. But for us, probably the more impactful way is just looking at our supply chain and thinking about what we buy and where we buy it. So we have that, we can use the tens of billions of dollars each year that we spend sourcing ingredients for our products and direct that money in a way that favors sort of cleaner ingredients in a way, if I can just be very simplistic about it. So we can, when we figure out that we're sourcing ingredients from an area that either has a lot of deforestation or has a lot of climate disruption, a lot of drought problems or things like that, we can look and see, is it something that we can address on the ground, or should we move that sourcing to somewhere else? And then when we think about our ingredients, we can also think about what is the carbon impact of each of those ingredients, and is there a substitute out there that actually has less of an impact? And that I talk about that example a lot. We have a huge pet food company, which most people don't know, but like Pedigree, Iams, Whiskas, and there's a variety of animal proteins that go into pet food. That mix that you use can impact what the carbon footprint is of that. So it's one way. And Sue, do you have other examples?
I do. There's a lot of work to be done in this area, and two, encouraging sets of activities that I would point to are the work that's going on palm oil and Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil that's come in the wake of a lot of investor engagement, moving companies. A year or two ago, Archer Daniel Midland's, for example, in the wake of shareholder pressure, committed to go 100% deforestation free across its products and supply chain. There's a lot of work to sort that out, especially once you get down to the smallholder farming level, and it becomes crucial, or it's crucial across the board, but more challenging in terms of transparency and tracking and so on. And another set of activities I'd point to that creates a basis for action and is encouraging is the Conservation and Financial Markets Initiative. Ceres is working together with World Wildlife Fund and World Business Council on Sustainable Development, focused in particular on beef and soy supply chains, again engaging investors and major finance institutions, looking at the whole supply chain and how, using tools, transparency, shared standards, and so forth, we can move entire sectors in particular food commodity supply chains.
Hi, I'm Daniel Mandel. I'm a private practice litigator here in DC. Energy is obviously key in this discussion, energy production and resourcing. where are energy companies in this debate amongst the non-state actors? What's being done to target them specifically, to get them to put more money into renewables or to clean up their own practices? And is the shale oil revolution a good or a bad thing, that natural gas is so incredibly cheap now, which has enabled us to displace coal as the top energy in the US, but natural gas is still very dirty and non-renewable. So is it a good or a bad or an acceptable bridge?
I'm happy to jump in if I feel like I'm speaking a little too much. Boy, energy companies are quite a heterogeneous mix. Even in the oil and gas sector, we're seeing an increasing transatlantic divide, right? So Shell just recently came out with its plan. It's not far enough, it's not fast enough, but planning to get to net zero by 2070, right? And making a play in electrification. You see in the face of investor engagement, Total committing to shift 20% of its capex to clean energy by 2030. Again, not far enough, not fast enough, but a material step for a major oil and gas company. Statoil just rebranded itself and is going big into offshore wind, taking its expertise with deep water ocean oil drilling. And stateside, we have, Exxon, even in the wake of this 2-degree scenario, 62% shareholder vote, put out some disclosures recently that are helpful in terms of they show just how flawed the assumptions of the company are in terms of ridiculously modest projections for market penetration of electric vehicles and so on. And stateside, these companies are really nowhere near as far along in the oil and gas sector. In the electric power sector, we're seeing incredible momentum. The biggest emitter in the United States, AEP, just committed to reduce its emissions 80% by 2050 with an interim target of a 60% reduction by 2030. And you're seeing DTE, Dominion, Duke, some of the biggest power companies in the United States beginning to make material shifts to really take stock. And we have a framework coming out next week to provide guidance on this of how their business and investment plans and practices fare under a 2-degree scenario. So that creates huge room for encouragement. We could have a whole separate conference on the shale oil revolution. I would say it's interesting to take stock of the fact that there's been a huge silver lining of actually gas revolution in that it fundamentally changed the economics, right? Drove down cost of fossil energy in a way that actually made some of the most risky from a climate and environmental perspective, deep water drilling, some of the more intensive oil sands and so forth, those projects became uneconomic because the cost of a barrel of oil plummeted with the shale revolution. So that's been a real silver lining, keeping those projects at bay and continuing to change those economics. It also makes it more challenging in terms of market penetration for electric vehicles, for example. And it's really important to dispel the notion that natural gas somehow has a really huge role as a so-called bridge fuel, especially when major long-lived infrastructure decisions are being made. When you're looking at not even multi-decadal, but potentially 100-year infrastructure on pipelines, distribution systems, at least 40 to 50-year generation infrastructure, that the curve that we need to be on in terms of greenhouse gas emissions reductions, even before you take into account fugitive methane emissions that have huge global warming forcing potential in a very bad way, even before you take all of that into account, it's a real mixed bag and should be deployed very, very sparingly. And the default assumption should be that there isn't a place for massive new infrastructure that's tied to natural gas or oil. We just don't have the room for it in terms of the overall energy pie if we're going to get on a real climate stabilization trajectory.
Do others want to weigh in? Okay, we'll try to take a few more questions, please.
Hi, I'm Tracy Bach from the Vermont Law School. I want to again thank you all for your individual contributions and Cinnamon for bringing everybody here. So I want to go back to the Paris Agreement for a moment and what's currently going along, happening with elaborating the implementation guidelines and the supposed COP24 deadline that we'll bump into this December. So Sue Reed, you ended with accountability in talking about the non-state actors And Subinias, you began with the enhanced transparency framework. So I'd like to ask all of you for your observations about what's happening with the elaboration of the Article 14.1, in particular, global stock take rules. Because it says that the COP is going to take stock take. It doesn't necessarily say the parties. And I'm wondering what you are seeing developing in terms of the non-party stakeholders' participation in the global stock take, and perhaps some hints of it in the Talanoa dialogue that's taking place right now. Thank you.
Do you want to start?
Well, this year there's a kind of, the Paris Agreement was not supposed to enter into force until 2020, until the last second. That provision was in there, and it came out at the last minute. So the thought was that because the first global stock take was to happen in 2023, you really needed some kind of global review before 2020, otherwise it would be like 8 years before you did a review. So this year there's this so-called Talanoa dialogue, which some people, it's slightly different, but people look at it as kind of a proto-global stock take. And if you look at it as a proto-global stock take, I think you see that there's kind of robust participation of non-state actors, you know, not as much probably as all non-state actors would want. They would probably want to be in the same meeting discussing these issues directly with the parties, but you've got some pushback from certain parties for having just like no barriers between states and, you know, non-states. But there are opportunities for non-state actors to contribute, and just a couple days ago was the deadline for submissions from non-state actors. For example, the U.S. Climate Alliance, the 16 or 17 states put in a submission on their view of ambition and what should happen, and you've got, you know, anyone who wanted to could put in some kind of submission. So parties are going to be able to take into account the views of non-state actors. I don't think the process is ready for, you know, a breaking down all walls between parties and non-parties, but you know, that's probably something I wouldn't support anyway.
Maybe I could add to that one interesting development of non-state actor participation in the international climate change negotiation, which happened last year when the COP approved modalities for the participation of indigenous peoples organizations in the indigenous peoples platform. So, I mean, this won't mean that they will participate at the same level as a party, but it means that they are pushing for that, and they are going to have a space where they can contribute to the international negotiations.
Thank you.
And I think we're running out of time, but the Talanoa dialogue really does seem to be taking more concrete shape, will be an iterative process. Certainly the non-state actors that we work with, both directly and through our We Mean Business and Global Investor Coalition partners, are very actively engaged working with the UNFCCC in terms of the design of that, so you maintain integrity with the negotiations of the parties and take into account some of the real economy elements that can usefully help inform those discussions in terms of feasibility and finance and so on, without co-opting that process.
All right, we only have 2 questions left, and we want to take them both. So I'd invite you to.
First of all, thank you for coming. It's been a really interesting discussion. I'm a 2L from Notre Dame Law School, and my question is for Ms. Binyas. So I'm really interested, I mean, despite the merits of the Paris Climate Accords, and I think it's a shame that this administration has decided not to join it, I'm concerned about the constitutionality of the actions that certain states have done. So it's not just been Hawaii that's passed legislation basically ratifying the Paris Climate Accords. I mean, they say, so it's Massachusetts, Washington, state legislature in Maryland has also proposed bills to force their governor to join the Climate Alliance. I think even the most staunch states' rights supporters would say that states don't really have the power, the treaty power, or the diplomacy power, and I was curious if you could maybe talk about that. Also, going forward, for state departments in the future, do you think it would be difficult trying to compete with, you know, state governors and how that would look? Thank you.
I think so.
Yeah, well, there are several constitutional issues, or at least 2, that arise when you look at state action. First you look at the compact clause and you look at kind of federalism type issues. So far I haven't seen compact clause issues because everything I've seen has been non-binding. It's some kind of statement, joint statement, or a memorandum of understanding that's clearly written in non-binding terms. So I don't, you know, maybe there's something at the very margin that raises an issue, but I haven't seen an issue like that. And on the issue, it's interesting, on the issue of whether the states are going beyond, you know, apart from kind of agreements, but whether they're stepping into areas that are the province of the federal government, the White House actually made a statement about it that was pretty reassuring. I was kind of surprised by it, but in response to some kind of question, this was several months ago, the White House spokesperson said that this climate change was a cooperative federalism type issue, and as long as the states were making their commitments with respect to their own emissions, there was not an issue. I don't have it verbatim. So I thought that was basically saying to the states, you know, if California wants to say, we, or even reflect internationally, you know, we commit to, in a non-binding way, reduce our emissions by X percent, our emissions, you know, that's perfectly fine. If California or if the U.S. Climate Alliance were to purport to speak for the entire country, you know, beyond their own borders, that might raise.
Sans the U.S. exercising its authority in, I guess, 2020 for withdrawing that $2 billion commitment. But, you know, you don't necessarily need to have the funds of non-state actors going into the institution's balance sheet, right? You could, as lawyers, we can set up parallel, you know, vehicles and achieve the same. But anyway, we can take this offline. But it's a pleasure. Thank you very much. Great panel.
All right, thank you. So I just want to take this last minute that we have and say thank you to each of our panelists for being here today, for your really interesting thoughts and sharing those with us, but also for all of the important work that you do in this area. So thank you very much. I really appreciate you being here and sharing your thoughts with us. So thank you.
Thank you.